Good evening, everyone. In compliance with the Open Public Meetings Law of New Jersey, notice of this July 21st, 2020 meeting of the Bridgewater Raritan Board of Education was provided on July 17th, 2020 by sending a 48-hour written notice to the Courier News, Star Ledger, Bridgewater Township Clerk, Raritan Borough Clerk, and by posting on the bulletin board in the Harmon V. Wade Administration Building. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Here.
Mrs. Hurley,
Here.
Mr. Walker,
Here.
Mr. Malik. Not yet. Mr. Singer,
Here.
Mr. Joshi.
Here.
Mrs. Gladstone
Here.
and Mrs. Barlow.
Here. Next, we're up for the closed session, whereas discussion by the board is required on matters that are exceptions to the requirement that a public body hold its meetings in public, and whereas the topics for discussion are legal matter litigation, personnel, BRSA grievance appeal, and personnel negotiations. Whereas it is expected that the details of the discussion may be made public as soon as the issues may be acted upon publicly. Be it resolved that the board enter into closed session at this time. All in favor?
So moved.
All
Aye.
opposed? Okay, we are now in closed session. Good evening, everyone. We just finished closed session and we're now up to item 6, the superintendent's report. Dr. Ficara?
Good evening. The superintendent's report tonight has 3 items. And the first item is actually a heads up on what's going to occur later on in this meeting. And that is that we have a resolution to appoint this evening the summer coaches, marching band, extracurricular activities. And that's on the resolution for later in this evening. The second item, we're going to have Ms. Anne-Marie Mattia give a report, a presentation on the science testing, which I'm sure you will enjoy. And then last but not least, I will do a combination of community relations report, which is an overview of our reopening efforts for September and just how we're proceeding with that. And I'll give you a detailed report that'll include what we're doing, what we're doing in the future, and report back to the results survey. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mrs. Anne-Marie Mattia.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm going to share, let me just actually back up. Put this in present mode, hold on. Okay. Okay, we're good. Can you see this?
Yes.
We're good.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So thank you again for having me. I'm going to actually go through this at a fairly quickly. Certainly, if you have any questions along the way, I'd be happy to answer them or at the end. But in the essence of time, I'm going to go through this quickly. So tonight, I'm going to be presenting on the NJS New Jersey Student Learning Assessment for Science results from the 2019 administration. So not this past spring, but the spring before. So timely. Because this is the first time that we're actually presenting on these assessment results, I wanted to give you a little bit of background and a little bit of context about its administration. So the NJSLA Science Assessment is a required state assessment, and it's administered to all students in grades 5, 8, and 11. It provides a snapshot of student performance against our New Jersey science standards, and those standards are banded in grades 3 to 5, 6 through 8, and then for individual courses at the high school level. And that's why we actually assess at the end of those bands. It is significantly different from our previous science assessment, the New Jersey Ask, which really is because our science standards today are more rigorous. They call more for an application of ideas and skills rather than just that memorization of content. And they really assess a student's ability to explain how or why phenomena occur, or really to provide some to be able to design problems for and solutions. Design solutions for problems. So definitely different from our previous standards. The structure of the NJSLA is similar to other state assessments that are administered in that they are developed around clusters with 2 to 5 questions. They are all based on a phenomena or a topic of study, and they include the 3 parts of our standards, which include our disciplinary core ideas, our science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. I'll talk more about that in another slide or two. But the good news is, even though they include all of these items are scored independently of each other, so a student can get one of those questions wrong and not lose complete points for the whole cluster. Also, similar to previous assessments, this is online. It is they use multiple choice, technology enhanced, and constructed response items. So that format is similar for students. To just provide a little bit more context about the actual standards itself, New Jersey adopted the New Jersey Student Learning Standards for Science back in 2014. These mirror the next generation science standards, and we needed to have full implementation for grades 6 through 12 by September of 2016, and then by the following September for grades K to 5. That following spring was the first time that this assessment was administered. And at that time, no results were shared with districts because it was considered a field test. So this is the first year that we've received any test results. As I mentioned, this is a new testing platform for students. For science, the previous assessment, as I mentioned, was a paper and pencil assessment. And it should be noted that there are 3 years between the assessments. So we aren't able to track individual students' performances year over year. For example, a 5th grade student who took it last year, we won't be able to look at their performance again for another 3 years, or actually 2 years now. But the good news is that this assessment is really meant to look for trends in a district's performance. So we look at the big picture. The other thing to keep in mind is that this particular assessment, actually the design of the test questions is very different than the other curricular measures that we use on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. So it's different than the labs, and it's different than the other assessments that we're administering. So with that in mind, I just want to talk for a moment about how we can use this data, because it's still important for us to consider, but it should be used in consideration or in combination with other classroom data, those other assessment pieces we have. And we really want to be able to look to see, how are our students performing against each of these particular areas. So as I mentioned before, we have 3 different areas within science. Our science standards include disciplinary core ideas, which are really our sciences. They have our science and engineering practices, which are really the practices that the students engage in as they go about trying to make sense of what they're learning and how they're investigating and critiquing and analyzing. And then they also look through this lens of cross-cutting concepts. Now, this cross-cutting concepts are unique to science standards in that they're included in the standards, but these big ideas really cut across multiple content areas. So even though we might be looking at patterns or cause and effect or structure and function in science or across the sciences, we can certainly actually use the same language within, different content areas like social studies or math. While, again, we're thinking about this as one data point, it's certainly necessary for us to be able to have conversations with our teachers and kind of explore some of these big ideas about, what patterns we're seeing, what do they suggest about the effectiveness of our programs for certain groups of students, about our resources, about allocation of time. So it is important information for us to look at and consider as we think about our next steps and what other information we might want. So with all of that in mind, last spring, we tested almost 2,000 students through grades 5, 8, and 11. You can see these numbers at the top here. And I'm going to go through, I'm going to go through this data pretty quickly. If you need me, again, to go back to any of this, I can afterwards. But I'm also going to break down some of this data for you as we go through the slides. So this assessment is broken up into 4 different levels of proficiency. For example, the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment for ELA and math is 5. This only has 4. So keeping that in mind, we have levels 1 through 4, proficient and advanced proficient are levels 3 and 4. And I've included for all grades, both our district performance and the state performance on this slide. So I'll give you one moment to look at that, but then we'll move on. I think you already received this anyway, so. Okay, if we zoom in sort of on our levels 3 and 4 to think about who are our students and what percentage of students actually met or exceeded our the expectations or the standards, you can see I've broken it into 2 different columns here. So at grade 5, we have 48%, a little more than 48% that met or were proficient or advanced. Grade 8 was 35%, and grade 11 is a little over 49% as compared to our state. So we see that grades 5 and 11 actually performed more similarly and at a higher rate of achievement or level of achievement than grade 8. You'll see this trend as we look across our different groups, and this actually mirrors the state performance as well. So something for us to think about and consider. We weren't able to ascertain any comparison data of actual science results from other districts because this was the first year, and possibly because of the fact that we were, on distance learning. But I was able to pull other comparison data for ELA and math. And I wanted you to be able to see how that same group of students performed. And just keeping in mind that levels 4 and 5 are meeting or exceeding for ELA and math as opposed to science. So in grade 5, we had 75% of students perform for that were meeting or exceeding, and 63% for math, as opposed to 48% for science. So we definitely see, that our levels in science are not as high as these other content areas. In grade 8, we had 87%, and we only had 41% in math, keeping in mind that that's the grade 8 state assessment on grade 8 math. And we have many of our students taking Algebra 1 and geometry, and those numbers are below. For grade 11, we have 77% of our students meeting or exceeding, as opposed to the other students, except that in this case, just keeping in mind that's of those who took the test, and not all students, not all juniors take the state assessment, because they possibly have met the graduation requirements in other ways. So you can see the difference here between our students, and then no math data was actually available at this level. But that was just a point of comparison, so you could see that our numbers, where our numbers are. So on this slide, I have a lot of numbers here, and this is just the breakdown of total numbers of our subgroups. I'm going to actually take a look at percentages on the next slide and then actually zoom in for each of these different groups. But this is just important to keep in mind when we think about our percentages. So on this slide, we have our comparison of subgroups and the percentages here. I'll let you look for a moment on this. I broke them down from levels 1 through level 4 for each of our groups, so you can take a look at how our students performed. It's actually easier to see on the next couple slides that are actually look at bar graphs. So this performance this graph shows us the performance of the subgroup based on race. So if you take a moment to look at this slide, you'll see that we have our blue or kind of grayish blue is grade 5, orange is grade 8, grade 11, and then all of our grades, and an average of all of our grades, and can sort of see how our students did across our different subgroups. In this case, it's notable that our Asian subgroup performed at a higher level of achievement than the other subgroups. You also see that we have this dip that we talked about in 8th grade as well. It's showing up within our subgroups here of race. This slide compares how our female students and our male students did, and you can see that they performed similarly across all grade levels with that same dip again in 8th grade. This slide looks at our programs. So if we take a look at our free and reduced lunch, section 504, the limited English proficiency, students with who receive special education services, as well as our general education students, you can see a comparison at a glance how our students are performing. Our students, obviously in general education, and from here, you can note that they are performing at higher levels of achievement. I just want to point out this one area. There's a missing bar here. There's no students in grade 5 who were proficient or advanced. So that number is not an error. That's accurate. There's nothing there representing that. So when we think about being that this is the first year, and there are some notable achievements for us to look at, to consider. Our students in grades 5, 8, and 11 all met or exceeded the standards as compared to their peers in the state by different levels of percentages. So that is something to consider as an achievement at this point. If we look at our next slide, 5 students in grade 5 actually had perfect scores of 300. and also our students in grade 5, over 70% of them near met or exceeded expectations in these domains, which is our 2 sciences, earth and space and physical. And when I say near met or exceeded, near met, they break down each of the different standards and different pieces of information into these subcategories. And, this is where we want our students to be either meeting or exceeding. So they kind of lump near and met together. So we have over 70% of our grade 5 students doing this in earth, space, and physical science, as well as over nearly 75% of students near meeting or above expectations for the practice of investigating. And here we have our grade 8. Over 60% of our students near met or exceeded within the areas of earth and space and life science. Our grade 11 students actually scored very well. 28 of our students in grade 11 scored a perfect score, so that was something good news. Over 70% of our grade 11 students near met or exceeded expectations in 2 areas of the practices, both investigating and critiquing, showing strength in our programs for that thinking. And then over 65% near met or exceeded expectations for all 3 of our science domains. This is just so you know, I just want to also mention that this is an integrated assessment at grade 11. And so while students take courses like biology, chemistry, and physics across the different grade levels, this particular assessment includes all 3 of those sciences. So with our notable achievements, we also still have some needs to address. And so these were some of the questions that we need to consider as we look at this data. The first being, how can we raise our overall achievement levels? As I mentioned, this is year 1, but still, how can we look to improve those levels? And then certainly, what is contributing to that low performance in grade 8? Trend or no trend, it's something still that I think that we need to look at. And then how can we set some goals to raise that achievement for our underperforming groups of students? And we notice those on those slides, correct? I also, as the former science and social studies supervisor, have the questions about our elementary schools and how they factor into that grade 5 success. As I mentioned, our standards are banded together, and so I'm interested to see if we can drill down to find out where our highest achieving students went to primary school and what those programs look like. And then finally, also, how can we create some opportunities for vertical articulation, not just within schools, within grade levels, but across schools? I think that's an important piece, and we actually talked about that in our program evaluation. Just to finish up here, we are going to be thinking about what interventions we can take for 2021. Right now, all we're doing is talking about reopening schools, but at some point we are going to talk about content areas. And when we do, we're going to look to have conversations with our teachers in our departments and grade levels about our areas of strength and need. And we're going to look at the standard progressions and identify areas of focus for instruction. Of course, taking into account, the missed instruction, missed content from last year, and then whatever this year brings. We also will need to think about our assessments and certainly collaborate within the department to discuss best instructional practices. And just wrapping up here, I just want to also just note that we are again in the middle of program evaluation. So a lot of this information we'll be able to dig deeper within our program evaluation to kind of find some of that comparison data, to look what other districts are doing, to look at our programs, and to talk about our strengths and areas of need. From that, we will make recommendations for for professional development, and that will inform our next steps with teachers. Part of that will be creating common assessments as both formative and summative measures, as well as performance-based. And then, of course, prioritizing our instructional focus based on, what the data is telling us. And certainly, all throughout all this, we're going to be looking at those subgroups and sort of drilling down and seeing, where are those gaps and deficits and what can we do about that. So even though this is the first year, it does provide us a baseline and some good information to work from as we kind of move through our program evaluation, and we take into account, what we're learning through that. The good news is that I think even though this assessment data was administered last year and it shows that we definitely have areas to improve, I think that working with teachers and as we work to implement the new standards, I do think that we have the practice is improving. I'm not sure if the data has caught up with that, if the assessment results have caught up with that yet. So hopefully we'll see that next year. Are there any questions before I exit out of here? Is there anything that you wanted me to go back to?
I had one question, Anne Marie.
Sure.
It's interesting that we teach science half a year, K through 4, and a full year in 5, and they did the best there, while 6, 7, 8 was the worst performing. Looking at that
Interesting.
data. Yeah, and then looking at the data, you can drill down and you can actually see where, if there's commonalities in what areas of the curriculum they weren't fully proficient in, correct? So that will help guide you also, even though it's the first year. So
We can drill down into the particular content areas. I mean, the different sciences, and then we can also look at the different practices. It doesn't include yet. We don't have information on the cross-cutting concepts, but we will. I'm assuming as we continue to get more information from the state. Again, this being the first year that they're sharing results, I do think we need to think about that again. And like you said, look at our other curricular measures to see how they align, and we can make some decisions about PD and programs and stuff. So,
and while we had started the program evaluation, we were in the first stages of it in science. When we
Yes.
went out in March, we stopped. So we kind of are on hiatus with our program evaluation, and we'll have to figure out when we're returning to it based on how things go.
is this test, so they're changing, are they going to change the test on us too? So is this baseline going to be accurate in a year or two? What's the status of that?
I haven't heard anything in terms of them changing the assessment. They, can get feedback. We had the field test, and this is the second year of administration. So they may be making some changes. I have not heard anything. I do know a recent change was just that regrouping of the science investigating, science practices into investigating, critiquing, and sense making. I think as teachers and teachers become more familiar with content and are able to instruct, and make sure that they're meeting standards in the way that the standards are calling for. Don't forget that the NGSS was a big shift alone, right? And then we have assessment that is working towards meeting, being able to assess that. There could be other changes, but I'm not aware of anything at this point.
Gotcha. Thank you.
No, thank
Great
you.
job. Great job.
Thank you, Anne Marie.
All right, very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Have a great night.
You too.
You
Take
too.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Dr. Ficara, you had the reopening survey update?
Yes. Andre, could you put up the slide? So, for those of you who are just tuning in or who haven't who I haven't been introduced to before, it might be good to reintroduce myself. My name is Dr. Ficara. I'm the interim superintendent of schools. I guess you could say I'm a typical interim superintendent of schools, meaning I failed at retirement, and that's why I came back to work. And I will be leaning on that experience and talking to you about that a little bit during the presentation. So I thought it would be good to give you an overview of the road back, which is the in context of what we're trying to do in terms of opening school. So the road back is a document that the governor released on June 29th. So if you go to the next slide, Andre. That document was released on June 29th and provided the guidelines which we have to synthesize all our decision making in terms of how we're going to open school in September. The governor, within those guidelines, also indicated that that decision had to be made 4 weeks prior to school. So that's August 3rd is what we're shooting for. So essentially, while a lot of work went on prior to June 29th, the actual guidelines, the specifics about what we have to adhere to in terms of opening school were published on June 29th. I started on July 1, and today is the 21st. So we are running at a fast pace, and we have essentially 4 weeks to synthesize 143 pages of guidelines and make decisions about how we're going to open 11 schools and 8,600 children. And the reason I mentioned my experience before is when we developed these timelines, I would never have believed that we would be given 4 months to come up with this plan. So those guidelines and the day in which it was delivered to us, the guidelines and the length of time that we have is set by the governor and the Department of Education. And it is not something that we would recommend that we do unless we had to do. We would certainly have played for more time and wanted to have more involvement. But this is a process that is taking place at kind of a foot race pace. Next slide. So before we go through, I want to take you through a timeline of where we began on July 1, where we are today, what we've come up with to date, and then how we plan on proceeding to the final announcement on August 3rd. So a couple of things we will be discussing, just a little bit of the language that we don't want to take for granted that people understand, because we're using it internally, and it's not necessarily, there are not necessarily common definitions for it. So the hybrid model, which you will hear me reference during the presentation, refers to in-person and remote virtual instruction combined. And there are a number of subset models that are being considered within that context. There's the alternate day model of hybrid. There's the every few days hybrid, and there's the weekly and we'll hybrid, and we'll be discussing, giving more detail as we go on. And the other word phrase that we're going to use a lot is cohort group, and that's that we're referring to individual small groups of students and our efforts to keep them together most or all of the day to obviously prevent the spread of the virus, which is what the guidelines that the governor has, which is at the basis, of the core at what the governor's guidelines are about. Next slide. We will also be talking about restart committees and pandemic committees. What's a restart committee? Some of you may have been familiar with the term September committee. That was the original term. When the governor came out, he adopted guidelines that required a restart committee, which we have. It's a district team that works directly with the superintendent on the reopening plans, providing and the superintendent's staff providing input and responses to the things that we're coming up with as we periodically meet with them. The pandemic response teams are school-based teams, and they work at the school with the principals on the individual plans that the principals are working with, and then pushing them up to be considered at the central office. Next slide. Who's on the pandemic response team? That's a question we get a lot. And so, and what does the pandemic response team do? They're working with the principal. Health and safety measures primarily are being considered at this time and at this stage. Health and safety protocols to go along with the measures. What training is going to need to take place, and how can we communicate with the communities and families? Next slide. And another question that we get frequently is, who is on these pandemic response teams that are working with the principals at the individual schools? Those are outlined in the governor's guidelines, and we just kind of lifted them right out of the guidelines and followed along. There's school principals, or in some schools, they're called lead persons, not in our district, but in other schools they are, other districts or charter schools. But so essentially the school principal, supervisors, teachers, teacher assistants, child study team members, school counselors, school nurses, school safety personnel, custodians, and parents. So that's sort of a prescribed recommendation, if not requirement, that the guidelines that were given to us on the 29th of June have prescribed for us. Andre? So the process to date. So on July 1st, I met with the central office team, and we worked from the 1st to the 6th with a holiday in between, trying to synthesize the guidelines so that we could develop and reduce a 143-page document into an internal document that we could provide to principals and their pandemic teams so that they could look at various aspects of opening a school, which I'll get into later. And then we gave them a document that would say something like page 33 will tell you the answer as to what the social distancing is in the classrooms or elsewhere, so that they wouldn't be overwhelmed with trying to read a 143-page document while they were trying to analyze how it applied to their buildings. So we also on July 6th developed a survey that many of you answered. I think we had over 6,000 responses to both parents and staff separate, but over 6,000 parent responses. And we'll go through that in a little while. On July 7th, we met with the principals, vice principals, and supervisors and said, here are the internal documents, internal guidelines that we gave you. We had discussions as to what we wanted them to do and asked that they come back to us or meet between July 8th and July 13th. And if you're looking at these guidelines, these dates and saying, these are really squished together very tightly and very fast paced. When I first made this timeline up, I said, no, that's impossible. My experience tells me that this is too much work to be done in such a short period of time. But when we look at the guidelines, we have no choice but to do it this way. So we were running at a fast pace to meet a deadline that was given to us by the governor and guidelines that was given to us approximately 4 weeks before that deadline. So we asked the principals to take all of 5 days and meet with their teams. And of course, their teams on July 8th, a good portion of their teams were on vacation. It's probably one of the biggest vacation months of the year. And develop individual school plans, brainstorm with as many people they can gather on their team, and also brainstorm with other schools so we could come up with hopefully plans that would be uniform across grade levels at least. From there, we took the principal survey and the feedback that we got from principals on the 13th and the 14th. And the central office team met for 2 days with the responses from the principals, re-met with principals, also met with the Restart Committee, which is that district committee, to report out where we were, took some of the information we got from the Restart Committee, suggestions and questions, back to the principals on the 17th to go back and revisit the plans that they were still developing and provide them with as much input as we could from what we got from community members that we were discussing these with. The next slide. So in that process, just circling back a little bit to what went on during that 3-week, 2.5 week period. Again, the governor's guidelines is the dominant guideline, the dominant force by which we have to decide everything. So when we look at transportation, we go back to the governor's guidelines. They're not suggestions. They're not a wish list. They're guidelines for us to comply with. School re-entry, what does that look like according to the governor's guidelines? Instructional space, how do you structure the instructional space? Running through the guidelines given to us. Meals, bathrooms, hallways, etc. So everything is being driven by guidelines that are given to us from the governor. I keep repeating that because I want to assure the public that we're just not making this up. I'm not a medical doctor, and we're taking advice from governors that has teams of people working with health professionals and providing us guidance that we are adhering to. I'm not pretending to be Dr. Fauci or somebody else here. We are following the guidelines that are given to us. Next slide. So I wanted to take you through some of the considerations just to give you an idea, and everything that is being considered is not on this list. It would be too extensive. So of course, social distancing at 6 feet apart is really a driver that drives almost everything we do. So one of the things in the that we have to consider, there has to be isolation rooms in each school. That comes from the guidelines. And that seems like on first blush, it was like, okay, let's pick an isolation room. But then we have to consider, is the isolation room age appropriate? You know, putting a 6-year-old in an isolation room is different than putting a 16-year-old in an isolation room. So how do we consider the age appropriateness of the room that we're going to ask a child to be in if they're in isolation because they have a temperature or showing illness? What's the location of that isolation room? Is it near the door? Would someone going to the isolation room infect the rest of the school building? So all of these separate individual questions had to be considered, and some of them involve extensive and multiple layers of conversation and considerations. Temperature taking of staff and students. So temperatures will be taken for all staff and all students entering the building. What does that look like? Principals are coming up with plans, coming back to us. We're saying, no, try this, try that. Yes, that's a good idea. Why don't you bring it to one of the other schools? That solves problems we didn't think about. So again, it's a constant exchange. How much PPE do you need for the staff that are involved in taking temperatures? Put that into your development of your plans and get back to central office as quickly as possible so we can begin ordering the PPE that's required. What does transportation look like? That's a moving target at the moment because we're not quite sure how many students are going to opt to be on that bus. Hallway flow. Guidelines want one-way hallways if possible. So we're looking at buildings for one-way flow. One-way hallways are possible in places like the high school. In some of the elementaries, one-way means you go out the back door and you have to walk around the complete other side of the building. So then we're falling back to a second level of which would be sort of like a two-way street on the hallway with signage telling you which way to go. Again, lots of possibilities. What supplies do principals need and what help do they need in taping or putting into those supplies? Special education and ELL requirements are generally above the general ed population. And now that we are back and we are under order by the governor to provide in-person schooling in September, some form. Once that kicks in, the special ed children, ELL children who have requirements above and beyond the general ed population have to receive that. And how do we fit that in? external traffic flow and drop off. We're anticipating huge numbers of students whose parents are opting to not put them on the bus and drive them to school. What is that going to look like in your typical elementary, middle, and the high school? What is that going to look like with drop off and pickup? What effects will that have on the entire community when this occurs on a daily basis? Something we have to bring to the police and the municipality when we get closer to understanding what that drop off and pickup is going to look like. Safety drills. There have been no reduction of required safety drills. Anyone who's been to school has been through a required exit drill on a fire drill. What does a fire drill look like with 6 foot distancing? Those are some of the questions that are still not answered by anyone, and we're trying to figure out. Others, a daily cleaning. There are requirements. How are we going to get the daily cleaning done? How often is the cleaning done? We will have to be removing furniture in order to comply with social distancing guidelines. Where does that furniture go? How does it get removed? And how does it get stored? Restroom use. We have to have some kind of monitoring of the bathrooms. We're looking at exterior monitoring, which would be limiting the number of students that could go into the bathroom at a time. But again, that's a plan schools have to come up with and meet with us for approval. Water fountains. There's one set of laws that says you have to have so many water fountains if you have so many students. And there's another set of laws that says you shouldn't be having children drink out of the same water fountain in an epidemic. So we're trying to untangle some of those conflicting regulations. Meal distribution, what does that look like with 6 foot distancing, recess, lockers and locker rooms where it's virtually impossible to have 6 foot distancing? Student and staff accommodations, we're working on that. Who's eligible? That's a whole nother area that of concern that we are working on in terms of trying to define what the governor's guidelines and what the health regulations are on staff and student accommodations. Social emotional learning is a part of what we have to consider. We're trying to get as much parent input as possible. We have the re-entry team for the district, and at the same time, we'll be having a meeting later this week with the, I think it's called the Schools Council or the Council of Schools, and those are basically the presidents and vice presidents or presidents and co-presidents of each school to get their feedback so that we can make sure that we're not misunderstanding or missing something that we could put into the plan that the community thought of and we didn't. Additional surveys. So once we narrow down a little bit further what it looks like we're going to propose, we'll have another set of parent surveys and teacher surveys to find out which they prefer and help guide us towards our final decision making. Next slide. So a deeper look, when those are the multiple things, plus there are others that have to be considered. As we started to dig in, we found, for example, in transportation, we are not sure at this moment, and we're trying to come up with a way to find out who truly wants to be on that bus. So if you're going to be on the bus, and we can verify that, or you're not going to be on that bus, we can verify that. Then we can look at how many children we actually have to transport on buses, and that will affect drop off and pick up as well when we estimate how many people are coming to each building. The health issue, there's issues of what students can opt out of school, what teachers can opt out of school, parent-teacher leave, teacher sick leave, who's eligible, what are the conditions. We're not going to make these things up. We're going to rely on contract. We're going to rely on medical expert advice. We're also trying to find out in terms of what are the ramifications for when, if and when at some point in time school is open and someone in a household comes down with COVID and we find out about it. What happens if a student in the building, just how many students have to be quarantined? Is it the class? Is it the school? What happens if it's the teacher who comes down with COVID? What happens if it's the teacher's spouse or the teacher's child from another school that's being quarantined? We have to find answers to all of this before school opens and get guidance from, again, the health officials. I'm not going to make this up. And we are not. And I often say, one of the things that has served me well is to know what I don't know. And we can all have opinions about things, but we're going to go on the guidance that's given to us, and what's unclear, we're going to seek clarification from our school physician and from the local health department. Ventilation, there's a question of ventilation in the buildings. These questions have come up in our discussions, and what we want to make sure is that we're checking with architects, engineers, attorneys, and the medical people. As far as we know now, there is no special ventilation requirements added because of the COVID situation. And we also know that as school buildings are built, we know that you need approval for a schematic, both by the Department of Education and within the context of them making a decision on their approval. Appropriate airflow is always a part of it. So we know we have ventilation that meets those requirements. We have to see if there's any ventilation requirements that go above and beyond that. Also, distance learning. There's been some, the governor's office put out that distance learning would be acceptable for a choice. But we also know that in that same article that we all saw, it said that more details would come out on Thursday. And so sometimes when we read headlines like there can be graduation and the details will come out next week, when we read the details, the graduation at that time said you can only have 50 people. So the headline put one thought in people's mind and the detail put another reality on us. Now they've subsequently brought that up to 500, but I caution everybody on reading that headline. The details have yet to come out. I hope that the overall statement correlates with what the detail actually says. But so we will be looking at that, and we've been working. We have some experience now under our belt with distance learning, and we have some lessons learned from last year and some new things that we want to improve going forward for next year. Special education, I spoke about before. There are layers of complexity in there because children are required to receive above and beyond what the gen ed population receives. We're working with our childcare providers. Our big question is, can you take the same number of students you took last year if you have them for more hours? So we're in the process of working on that. We do not have the answers. And when we produce a schedule, those answers may deviate a little bit. Room size is something that is one of our biggest concerns and drivers because that tells us how many children we can fit in the building. And I just want to give you an example of that. Andre, the next slide. So if you look at this as an imaginary typical classroom, we then have to take this classroom and say, we get out our tape measures and say, what is the distance between desks? And we know that 6 foot distancing for everybody in the room is a requirement. And so if you can go to the next slide, and then so our classrooms may look like that. So there's 2 levels here. One, we're taking classrooms, marking them. We're in the process of doing this. You would tape off the areas where the student's desk would be and the teacher desk would be to ensure that in the cleaning process, they were put back in the proper location. That's one area of work. The other piece of information why this is important is now you do look at a classroom that may have fit 20 to 25 students, and now you're looking at 11. So how many students can you now fit in the building when you reduce the numbers to that level? Next slide. So we also put out, as I spoke earlier, community surveys, and hopefully as we're developing plans and looking at what the community said back to us, it helps us develop some commonalities. So the next slide. So if we look at one of the questions, and we'll go through quite a few of them here, which of the following options would you prefer when schools reopen in September? So 11% said, I'm not sure. 25% said they wanted to continue with distance learning. 30% said they wanted a blended approach, meaning part-time in school and part-time at home. And 34% wanted in-person total back to school as normal. So when we look at that, at first blush, it looks like, gee, that tells us we're pretty much all over the place. But when the next slide, we combined those people who said they wanted a blended approach, which is sometime in school, with an in-person approach full-time in school, you actually have 64% of the population want to have some in-person schooling. And that does correlate with what the governor is saying we must have. Next slide. Additionally, and here is one of the complicators, 68% of the parents answering the survey indicated that they would transport their own child to school. What we're in the process of finding out now is it's one thing to say that on the survey, it's another thing to commit to that. So we're trying to come up with ways of getting hard data on that, so we actually can know who the children are that would need to be transported to school. Next. We also indicate your support for maintaining 6 foot distancing and separation in school. And there's a pretty good majority there of 60% said they highly support it. And another 17% said they somewhat support that. So when you put that support, combine those two together, you do end up with some consensus that 77% of the people either somewhat or absolutely support social distancing, which is one of the things we are adhering to. Next slide. So indicate your support for 6 feet of separation between students on the buses. 58% highly support that. 15% somewhat support that. Next slide. So when you take somewhat support and highly support, you have an overwhelming majority of people who want 6 feet support, 6 feet separation on the buses. Now, herein lies the dilemma. If 68% of the people do not transport their students, it will be possible to provide 6-foot separation. As that number rises or diminishes, if the actual number comes out less than that, it's impossible to have 6-foot separation on a bus, because the 6-foot separation on a bus is about 11 students. We have buses of 54 passengers. The dilemma is going to come in, if we can talk in extremes to make a point. If everybody wants to have busing, that would be 54 students per bus. And considering we would only have 11 to fit, if we sticking to the social distancing, we would probably need 4 to 5 times the number of buses and bus drivers. And there are not that many in the state of New Jersey that we could come up with. So busing is something we need to get a handle on, and we're going to start with securing what we actually have, and then offering options based on what we have. And quite frankly, if we go down to a sizable number of students, then parents are going to have to make a choice of putting children on a bus that does not have 6-foot separation, or driving them on their own. Next. Support for daily temperatures was and that's upon entrance into the building, 69%, and somewhat support 73%. Next slide shows that we have this is probably the largest majority, 82% want temperatures taken on a daily basis of both students and staff entering the building. Next slide. And static grouping, this is cohort groups who, if we have a static grouping of students, 56% want to see that, 19%, 66% highly supported, and 19% somewhat supported. Again, combining them both, there's a pretty good consensus for people wanting to see cohort groups, static student cohort groups. We are able to achieve that at the elementary level, K-8. That is an impossibility at the high school by the nature of a high school. It's not unique to our high school, it's every high school. There is no such cohort group that would have the same language, the same AP course, the same electives. It's just not. High schools are structured, as you know, completely differently than elementary and middle schools, and we just do not have, there's no possible structure to provide children with the electives, the APs, and the honor courses that they need to take, and then keep them in a cohort. It's sort of self-evident, I'm sure. Next. So what are the commonalities that we that we can glean from the survey? That most people want some in-service instruction, in-person instruction. And again, that correlates with the governor's guidelines. Most people want 6-foot social distancing. And most people want temperatures being taken daily from students and staff. And most people want a static cohort group, and we are going to provide that where we can. Next slide. So what we have now, and I can't preface this enough, this is not a final decision. This is a midway through the month, or a little more than midway through the month, of assessment of where we are. We met with the principals on numerous occasions and supervisors. 6-foot distancing is the factor that is driving all our decisions. And with that, it appears at the K-8 level, we can fit 50% of the students in the building. If you think back to the classroom I just described, that basically essentially cuts the population in half. And what that from there dictates to us is that if you have half the school, if you can only fit half the population, what does the schedule look like and flow like from there? So there's a daily A-B schedule. So your child would either be an A or a B schedule. And in one of the options, it would look like A was Mondays and Wednesdays, B was Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we would have a rotating Friday. So A one week, B next week. One idea, again, not the final idea. Our principals saw that in interacting in their professional groups and going to visiting podcasts and networking with other school districts, both central staff and principals saw that districts some districts were going on a weekly AB. And so that was thrown into the hopper. They're examining that. Don't have much to offer on that at the moment. Also, what was thrown out there, again, coming up from the pandemic teams, parents, teachers, other ideas from other communities, a daily AAA day and BB day with a rotating Wednesday. And what I mean by that is if it would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for the A's, and then Thursday, Friday for the B's, and the Wednesday would be the rotating A-B day, so that it would be every other week. Another possibility that was thrown out there is, I shouldn't say thrown out, that's a poor word choice, that's been examined by principals and brainstorming possibilities as well as central office, is a AA being a Monday, Tuesday with a virtual day on the Wednesday and a BB day in the schedule on Thursday, Friday. So these are the things that are being considered. We are going to synthesize them down to what are the most probable and most efficient, both educationally and safety-wise for the students. And then we will be coming out again and developing some surveys and getting input after we've narrowed them down. I also can't fail to impart that we're looking at 4 hours of instruction in person with an end of the day distance learning period. And the reason we're looking for in person for 4 hours of instruction straight through is that there would be no lunches or recess. There's virtually no room to create a lunch situation. Most people know that when we build schools, you take your high school, for example, has approximately 2,500 students. They would never build a cafeteria that housed all 2,500 students at the same time. So we are already, as a matter of course, in a non-COVID time, dividing up the population into smaller groups to fit them through periods of lunch. If you were going to try to do something like that with social distancing, there just aren't enough of hours there's not enough space in the day to actually get that done, even if you started lunch from the minute you walk through the door. So we're looking in all cases as a 4-hour day with a grab and go lunch for economically disadvantaged children to make sure that we comply with the law. Next slide. The high school is looking at right now 33% of the students coming in 3 cohorts. I have asked them to go back to see if they could possibly get 50% in. They have a lot of good reasons as to why, because the size of that high school and the amount of movement and students moving through the halls, it's as the as they described, the administration described it, it's sometimes like a traffic jam. And when you're cutting that population in half, you're actually having a cohort group of 1,200. But I asked to take a serious look at that, and maybe when we get some answers regarding how many people will choose distance learning and not coming to school, if those numbers are reduced, we might be able to get that up to a 50%. The most work they've done at the moment, and again, we're still not closing the door on other options, is it would look like cohort A would be on day 1 and day 2 of the week, so Monday, Tuesday, in person. Cohort B would come in on day 3 and day 4 in person. And then cohort C would come in on day 5 and day 1 of the following week. And we would continue the rotation in that manner. Again, this is not a final answer. It is something that they're working on, and we will be coming back with more ideas, or maybe the same idea, but certainly fleshing out more details for you at a later date, keeping in mind we have to make a decision by August 3rd and announce that to parents according to the governor's guidelines and mandates. Next slide, please. So the process going forward, we're actually a day behind. So last night we had finance committee meetings looking at reentry plans through the eyes of finance, and personnel through the eyes of personnel, and curriculum through the eyes of curriculum, trying to keep the board as much in the loop as we possibly can. And then, of course, tonight, doing this report out to the public to hopefully get as many people hearing what we can, and we will post this online so that it's not just taken away from you. And on, I guess that's tomorrow, I'll be meeting with the Council of Schools, and that's direct meeting with parents to hear what their concerns and preferences are. Then we will begin, as we whittle things down, either the 22nd or the 23rd, depending on when the governor's new guidelines come out on distance learning, be going out with some more surveys and saying to the parents, we think we might be looking at these options. What do you prefer? And the same with the teachers. What do you prefer? And hopefully we can come up with some commonalities. And then on the 23rd and the 28th, we will be meeting with principals, providing the feedback that we've received from board, from councils, from pandemic teams, and from re-entry teams to see if we can tweak and react to the concerns and the input we got from the community. We'll come back to the Restart Committee meeting on the 27th, and then the Board of Education meeting, Board of Education committee meetings on the 28th. And then we will take back all the information that we received from the surveys, from the parent groups, from the reentry committees, from the pandemic committees, and the central office cabinet will work until we come up with a recommendation that we will present to the board on August 3rd. And that will be our recommendation for a reentry plan. As you can see, from August 1st through July 1st to August 1st, we are really running at a fast pace and making incredible amounts of decisions and trying to bring in as many professionals in areas that we do not have expertise, particularly in the medical area. I am not going to guess at what a particular, if there's an issue that's unclear, I'm going to get advice from a school physician and the Board of Health and make decisions from there. And so essentially, that's where we are now, and where we're headed. I hope you can bear with us and be patient. As I said to every group I presented this to, please don't shoot the messenger. This was not the superintendent or the board's timetable. This was a timetable that was thrust upon us, and there are regulations which we must abide by. And while I understand them, the reasoning behind it, I think it's a good thing that we're forced to tell parents as early as August 3rd what their children's schedules are going to look like in September, and to prepare for childcare. I know childcare is going to be an issue. When we can only fit 50% of our kids in the school at a time, we know there are going to be childcare issues. The dilemma for us is we can't relieve those issues because we're already maximizing the number of kids we can fit into a building. So there's some built-in problems that stem from the guidance, and I'm not knocking the guidance. The guidance was built with medical personnel and people who know more about pandemics than I certainly do, or the board, and so we're following their guidance. If I could have it my way, we would have had a little bit more time before we opened school, or we would have had the guidelines a few weeks or a few months before they came out. But unfortunately, we are stuck with the deadlines we have. We got them on we got the guidelines on the 29th. We have to be completed by the 3rd, and we're doing the best we can within that context. So with that, I thank you, and we can take that, move on. Andre?
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Mattia, for the science testing report, and Dr. Ficara for the superintendent's report. I know it's a little late now in the meeting, but I would like to welcome Dr. Ficara to his first Bridgewater Raritan board meeting, and hopefully many more to come. I know he has been introduced previously when we signed the contract to hire him a few months ago. We are thrilled to have him here. He brings a wealth of experience, including about 25 years as a superintendent or interim superintendent in school districts as big as 11,500 students. Prior to that, he had many years of experience in a variety of administrative positions and as a teacher. He has served as a member of the Board of Trustees for several organizations, including Drew University. We're extremely fortunate to have him with us, and we look forward to great things happening under his leadership of our district. Welcome, Dr. Ficara.
Thank you.
I want to reiterate the difficult position our school district is in, as well as others in New Jersey. For us, it is even more challenging since we are changing leadership at a crucial time. The governor's guidance for reopening schools was just received June 29th. Dr. Ficara started July 1st, just 3 weeks ago. He and the staff have 1 month, including the few weeks he's already been here, to come up with a plan to reopen our schools. They have been working feverishly, digesting the information in the governor's guidelines and moving forward to develop a plan to deliver to the governor the first week of August. If Dr. Ficara can pull us through this, he can handle any challenge we throw his way. Please try to be understanding of the Herculean effort this will take and the need for him and the staff to focus on pulling this feat off. And just a closing comment, please continue to follow the CDC guidelines to keep BR safe and well. Thank you. And next we are up to, normally we'd have the vice president's report, but we don't have that today. We'll be skipping it. And now we are up to the committee reports, and we have Mr. Malik first with academic.
We met on July 15th at 6:30. In attendance was myself, Ms. Gladstone, Ms. Hurley, and Ms. Barlow. She joined at 8 o'clock. In addition, Ms. Jones, Dr. Ficara, and Anne Marie Mattia. First, we had the science testing report. Ms. Mattia presented the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment for Science, the NJSLAS, which measures student proficiency in grades 5, 8, and 11 related to science standards. The science standards require assessment tasks that examine students' performance of scientific and engineering practices in the context of cross-cutting concepts and disciplinary core ideas. That's from the NJDOE. This was the first year that districts received performance data for the new test, and we just had that presentation. And then in the meeting, one BOE member asked if they could see the performance data going forward. Next, we had the distance learning surveys. Dr. Ficara reviewed the district's process and progress in planning for our September reopening. A BOE member asked about survey feedback regarding distance learning in the spring. Some takeaways were briefly discussed, but we focused more on the most recent survey. A BOE member then shared concerns regarding student conduct in September in light of any new requirements, masks, distancing, etc. This is a topic that is currently being explored at every building and level. A member suggested reviewing our HIP process and making that information more accessible on the district website. Next, we had policy review. First was 2431.3 heat acclimation policy for student athlete safety, 2622 student assessment, 5610 suspension, R5610 suspension procedures, and 5620 expulsion. The committee next reviewed policies with mandated revisions from Strauss-Esme. Regarding the heat acclimation policy, the academic committee agreed to add the optional language to include sports at the middle school. They asked if we could post the NJSIAA heat participation policy document on the district website, and if we could develop a similar policy for marching band and other activities. Regarding the suspension policy and regulation, the academic committee also supported the optional language, which includes appointing a special committee of a board and event a regular board meeting is canceled and a decision needs to be made regarding the continuation of a suspension. And finally, a Board of Ed member expressed the hope that more diverse literature will be included when ELA begins to pilot new resources during the 2020-2021 school year, and members discussed the importance of promoting equity and inclusivity. We adjourned at 8:50 p.m. Any questions?
I want to comment on the heat acclimation. I mean, we could just change that to student heat acclimation policy across the district. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that was also part of the discussions. In the meeting, we were considering having a completely separate one, since this one focuses on the sports. But Ms. Gladstone mentioned I forget which school district they did what you're suggesting, where it's just one very broad policy.
Okay.
I think, do you mind me interjecting quickly, Zach?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because the policy is from Strauss-Esme and it's mandated and the language was mandated, and they're really making it so that I think that if there's any changes to NJ, let me get this right.
SIAA.
SIAA, yes. If there are changes that it would automatically update in this case. So the suggestion was that we actually link their policy to our website so that we could access it, parents could access it, and then use that policy as a model to create a parallel one for other activities, marching band. But this way we keep it, as it was mandated.
Any other questions?
One more. I was looking at the suspension policy. Are we following that now? I mean, I mentioned that. Do we have to approve all suspensions, or just long-term, or how's that work? I was in reading it by the next board meeting. Is that what the policy says?
What it looks like it's saying, at least this one, what it's saying is that, within 2 board meetings after the suspension takes place, if the board doesn't weigh in either way, then that means the suspension has ended and students would re-enter school. And they said that the way it reads is that's kind of typical timeline. But in the instance, there's some kind of extenuating reason why the board feels like the suspension should continue beyond that, you would have to make the decision by that second board meeting. In the case, and this was where the optional language comes in the case where you don't have a second board meeting for some reason or other, the optional language would be that the board president with the superintendent or a designee forms a committee and makes that decision, which then would be discussed at the subsequent board meeting. in the event there's not two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just kind of reading. I didn't know if we had to see, a form every suspension or be informed of it or how that worked. I mean, the superintendent was. I just thought that's a lot.
We do get a suspension report.
Right, we do, but sometimes it's it's usually monthly. So I didn't know if this said that we had to see the report weekly because it had 2 board meetings involved, like with HIB, we accept and then affirm. So I was just wondering if that was the process of that.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Malik. Next, we've got community relations with Mr. Joshi.
Yeah, we met last Tuesday, and my report is basically going to be what Dr. Ficarra went over this evening. So I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, but I do want to let everyone know that our website is going to be a resource for all the updates that will be coming out. So I just want to let everyone know in the community know that the website is the key, and please visit for any updates that will be coming out. Yeah.
Yes.
AJ, is there a date by which the full parent survey results are going to be released, or are they going to be released?
That's a good question. I think with this new transportation survey that was going out, I'm not sure if we're going to put all of the pie charts on, Dr. Ficarra, because I think you just went over some of them. Maybe we can put what you went over this evening on there. For
Yeah,
people to view.
I thought that we would post the presentation.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Joshi? Okay, thank you. And next, we've got FFT with Mr. Walker.
Yeah, we met on June 13 remotely. In attendance was myself, Mrs. Mead, Mr. Singer, Mrs. Barlow, Mr. Stars, and Dr. Ficarra. The first item on the agenda, we reviewed the business agenda. You just see this evening. We discussed the business agenda. The specific item we paid attention to was the toilet waiver and the change orders for summer projects and the transportation resolutions. We support them all, and they're all on the agenda this evening for approval. Next, we had a summer projects update. Mr. Starr was indicating that the high school building 200 roof replacement was going on, and the Adamsville Fire Department Adamsville Fire Alarm project was working. Both projects are currently on time and within budget. The roof, even at 200 building, was kept tight during that large rainstorm we had at what was it, Faye, when Faye came through. So they did a good job getting that done. There's no recommendations at this time. Transportation contractor payments. Mr. Stars discussed the negotiations with 3 main bus company contractors for payments during the time of distance learning. And what you'll see, we recommend a contract amendment for first student is on the BOE agenda for this evening. We had a security update. Dr. Ficarra provided the community with the most recent conversation with the mayor concerning the SROs and Class 3 officers for the upcoming year. The information concerning security access and cameras to be obtained, we're looking for some information concerning the security access and cameras to be obtained for us at the next meeting. We had a request for the committee discussed a request for use of fields for camp for an outside group. The committee determined that there should be no use of fields until we can reopen for our own student teams. There's no action at this time needed. You'll see that on policy for first reading, policy 8462, reporting of potentially missing and abused students. We recommend the changes that it was mandated changes by Strauss Esme. There was a question raised about the notice of provision in certain areas. Peter is looking into that, and he'll get that information to us. You'll see the policy 8462 on the agenda for this evening for first reading. In other matters, the community is informed that the formal notifications of revised state aid, which is a reduction of $432,000 reduction. We are also informed that Mr. Stars is completing the FEMA grant application for $130,000. He's working on it. There was a brief conversation about the reopening survey results that we had. There's no recommendations at the time. We adjourned at 8:04 p.m. and our next normal meeting is August 17th at 6:30 p.m. Any questions? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Walker. Next, we've got Personnel Committee with Mrs. Gladstone.
Thank you. The Personnel Committee met on July 13th at 4:30 p.m. In attendance, besides myself, was Mrs. Barlow, Mr. Joshi, Dr. Fakara, and Dr. Valani. We first went over the draft personnel addendum. We reviewed the addendum, and they were recommended to the full board for tonight. Secondly, Dr. Valani reviewed with the committee a draft policy of 5750, which is equal educational opportunity, and edits made to several affirmative action complaint documents. Our attorney, Dr. Celso, forwarded additional policy and regulation updates related to affirmative action following the committee meeting. The policies and regulations are to be soon recommended to the full board. I thought they were going to be on tonight. I didn't see them, so I'm assuming the next meeting. Policy updates. As part of our yearly review, Dr. Valani reviewed with the committee. Well, before I get to that part, there's a brand new policy that Strauss Esme has given us, the draft of policy 1649. It's called Federal Families First Coronavirus (parentheses COVID-19) Response Act. That is on for first reading tonight. We also discussed, we had a preliminary discussion on bylaw 0143, which is the board member election and appointment. That's when we discussed how the order when we nominate and vote on candidates for filling a board vacancy. So that we just had a preliminary discussion on that. Policy review. There are about 12 policies and regulations. I'm not going to list them all. They have to do mostly with evaluation of staff members, electronic communications. About 12, like I said, they're on in the minutes that were just reviewed as an annual activity, just to make sure that we are not missing anything. And Dr. Valani felt that they're good to go as is. There were no updates needed to be made. Next, we had a short discussion. Dr. Fakara reviewed with the committee new hiring guidelines. Personnel matters. Dr. Valani shared with committee members preliminary information regarding confidential personnel matters. And should the board need action, Dr. Fakara will share the details at the appropriate time. We also discussed the substitute pay rates for the 2020-21 school year. Next, we had a school safety update. There's a resolution in tonight's meeting called Alyssa's Law Compliance. We had a talk about, Dr. Valani shared with us that she went through a course, contact tracing training through Johns Hopkins. And we had a brief discussion on the camera installation walkthroughs. We heard from Dr. Fakara on his meeting with the mayor and where they discussed SROs and class 3 officers. And meeting, we talked about the health official guidance for the COVID plans, safety plans. Let's see, what else? We discussed quickly the committee calendar, what's coming up for the month of July, anything else that had to be reviewed, and that's it. That's the next meeting is August 17th. The next meeting for personnel items only would be August 17th. But as mentioned before, there will be a committee meeting next week to hear the next step in the reopening plans from Dr. Fakara. And we adjourned at 6:10 p.m. Are there any questions?
Just a comment. I'm glad you're looking at that voting policy.
Okay, good. Yeah, we got some words. Karen took some notes, and I'm sure the next, not Karen, I'm sorry, Dr. Valani took some notes, and we'll be coming back.
We had a lot of concerns about that voting policy.
Great.
Anything else?
Yeah, just one. On tonight's agenda, underneath the personnel section or committee minute section, it says you had a meeting with the mayor with SROs and
Dr. Fakara, yeah. Dr. Fakara had a meeting, and he just gave us an update of that was the first time they met. So I don't know if he wants to say a few words. I'm not sure.
Yes, we had a brief cordial meeting, and we discussed SROs and possibilities, and then we have a follow-up meeting that is scheduled somewhere next week, I believe, on my calendar. So I will get back to you with more information.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mrs. Gladstone.
Yep.
Next, we're up to the liaison and delegate reports. Does anyone have anything to report? Okay, sounds like everything is quiet there. We're now up to the first opportunity for open public comment. Individual and or groups are invited to present their concerns, comments, and requests to the Board of Education at this time for any matters. In accordance with board policy, members of the public are allotted this opportunity to address the board for a maximum of 5 minutes during this period of the meeting. As this meeting is being conducted remotely as a virtual meeting, all public comments can be made by completing the form online. Board members are able to see all comments and will be posted for viewing at the appropriate point in the meeting. And you should see it up on your screen in just a minute, and we'll give people time to read that.
Is the second public comment section open? Per two of the comments in there, I'm not sure it is, so I just wanted to.
There's something is not open completely.
Yeah, is someone able to check with that?
The second comment section opens up after this one closes.
Okay, thank you.
I just heard from somebody that the public comment link. Oh, I guess that somebody else addressed that. Never mind.
I just went on to the YouTube site, and the first public comment link does not work. It goes to 624, and the second public comment link is now open, but it also says 624.
But people are able to post comments, it looks like.
People were able to post comments, but
Yeah, I
don't
think the
know how
first
they're
one
able
is
to do it now.
closed.
The first one is closed, and the second one should be opening soon, if it's not open already.
The second one is open, but it does say 624. So if that's just an error and people can use it anyhow, then that's
Yes.
fine. I just want to make sure that it goes to the right spreadsheet that we're going to look at later.
So are we okay there?
I believe so.
Okay. Okay. So why don't we go ahead at this point? Dr. Ficara, I don't know if you wanted to address any of these. I know there was one question, I think, about the $500,000 expenses from 2 vendors. Yes, Mrs. Gladstone.
I spoke to Karen about this. If the initially some of the math textbook items were listed in the business section under purchases, and they're now under the curriculum section as textbook adoptions always have been. So the amount that I don't think though that was removed from the business list. So when you'll see in curriculum, the list, as we get to that, you see curriculum 2102 has all the textbook adoptions and purchases. Okay, and actually there are a few more books that's that whole process where the academic committee had been updated for a long period of time on the whole process of replacing all these books from grade 6 through high school. But I think when we get to the business section of the agenda, we're going to have to make a change to get rid of those math items because it's the duplication.
Okay, so does that?
So if you look at the curriculum part of it, you'll see that anywhere where it says big ideas math, that's actually centage. So the big idea math is for 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, algebra, geometry, algebra 2. And then it's also calculus. And so, yes, as Jill was saying, those are the textbooks that were recommended out of the process of program evaluation. And then we piloted and we went from basically using 6 different publishing companies to one consistent resource from 6th grade through algebra 2. And these are also online resources that students will be able to use, in distance learning as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ms. Gladstone, did you have a question? Okay. Okay, next we are up to item 11, which is approval of minutes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. Next, we're up to approval of action items. And the first one is for personnel 21-01 and 21-02. But in closed session, we are going to add another item, personnel 21-03. And let me go ahead and read that. Give me 1 second. Okay, so the addition would be resolved that the Board of Education, upon recommendation of the interim superintendent, approves the personnel addendum, and it's an attachment with the list of the fall coaches for the high school. And it would be for a 1-month period of time that it would be approved at this point, and we would do it in monthly increments. And it would also, the start of doing the fall athletics would be dependent for the students. Their activity will not begin until the superintendent has reviewed the safety protocols, and those safety protocols are in place.
So
Thank you.
Second.
I guess we probably need to do a roll call
Yes.
More discussion first.
or discussion first. Thank you. Any discussion on adding that personnel item?
Let's get it done.
So,
It's added, the item is added with the language that you added as a motion?
that would be my understanding, yes.
Okay.
Did you have any changes to it? Because we can discuss that.
I have no changes. I just wanted to make sure that that was part of the actual personnel item.
Okay. And before voting, I just want to thank, Dr. Ficara, I think did a lot of work behind the scenes to pull this together and make it happen. So thank you very much. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone.
Yes, I also wanted to thank, in addition to what Mrs. Barlow said, Dr. Villani for getting the drafts of the initial drafts of the safety protocols to us this afternoon. So I want to add that. Thank you.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, and I'm sorry, Dr. Villani, for not adding you in there. Thank you, Ms. Gladstone, for covering. So the motion carries. Now, Mr. Stars, does that just add this item to the personnel items, and we need to vote on all three, or this one's done and we just need to vote on the other two?
That was for the addition to the three. So now you're voting on the three.
Okay. So now, is there any discussion on any of the three personnel items? I guess we need a motion first.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
Okay, any discussion on any of the three?
How many open positions are there still, Dr. Ficara or Karen, to fill? Are we do we have a full roster for the fall of staff? Are we still trying to fill any?
I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you on that. I know that there has been a steady flow of positions being filled with personnel interviewing on a daily basis. And
Okay.
nothing's been brought to my attention as having a serious gap. But I will take a look at, see how many openings by grade level and subject area and get that out to you.
Good. Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, and the other thing I should have mentioned is the list of the coaches and the stipends, the associated information will be posted online. So if anyone has any questions about that. Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. Next, we are up to curriculum. And we have curriculum 21-01 and 21-02. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion?
Well, I just want to make sure, based on Jill's comments, this is good to go?
It's good to go. What do you mean?
Yes, it's good to go. It's correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other discussion? Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. Next, we're up to business 2101 through business 21-13. Is there a motion?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion?
Yes. Do we have to make a motion to change, to delete some of those math items in this, Peter?
I don't believe so because they're both the same. So it's okay. It's not, we're not going to be ordering double.
Okay. I didn't think we were, but
Any other discussion? Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. And I just want to thank the Hillside School PTO for the gift of the playground equipment. And give me a second here. Okay, next we're up to special services. Special services 21-01 through 21-03.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. Next, we're up to other 21-01 through other 21-04.
So moved.
Oh, we have the resolution, Jackie. Oh, no, we got that. Never mind. I'm sorry.
Okay,
All right. If no one moved it, I'll move it. No one second, I'll second.
For second.
I think we're covered now. Okay, any discussion?
Just a question. I assume that since the HIB that we're affirming was before Dr. Ficarra's time, he doesn't need to sign off on it, right?
I did sign off on that.
On the 619 one?
Yeah, because we had the report came in on my watch, and this is the one that we reviewed on Friday. That's correct? So,
No, I'm talking about I think that's the receipt. I'm talking about the affirm 21-02, which was from June 19th.
oh, I'm sorry. So 21-02 is the one is.
I read it as you're affirming the superintendent's decision at that time. So it was the superintendent at that time that you're affirming.
And that's just what I wanted to confirm. So that's fine. Thanks.
Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. And next we are up to policy. Policy 21-01 through policy 21-03.
So moved.
Second.
Actually, there's a typo. It should be 2104. There's two 2103s.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Okay, so through policy 21-04.
I'll still make the motion.
Second.
Still second it? Or will someone second it?
Second.
Second.
AJ did.
Okay, any discussion?
I have a question with regard to policy 1649, the Federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act. On page 5 of it, section A, subsection 2, subsection D, it talks about requirements to restore the employee when the employer has less than 25 employees. And I'm just trying to figure out if that's language that we actually need in here, or can that be removed because it doesn't apply to us?
It could. You know what it could apply to is BR Cares or something like that. Would that apply to that, Peter?
No, because they're district employees, so it's not
Okay.
It doesn't sound like it applies to us.
Does it hurt to have it in there?
Well, it doesn't hurt to have it in there. It doesn't apply. I cannot think of a circumstance how it applies to us.
Right.
These policies that are mandatory policies that were reviewed by Strauss, Esme, and others with their attorneys, it's best not to change them, but I don't see a harm in, I can't possibly think of a way where we would fit under an employee who employed less than 25.
Right, and that's why I brought it up, just because I thought it was an odd circumstance to have it in there. I don't have a problem with it if it doesn't hurt us.
So can we just change that for the second reading then, or have the personnel committee look at it again for a second reading?
It's a good idea.
Okay.
The other question I had was under the Sick Leave Act, can an employee get two bites at that? Where if an employee is, let's say, home with their sick child, and then as they're taking care of that child, contracts the virus on their own, is there a way for them to still fall under the Sick Leave Act, which might be a higher threshold of pay, rather than having them to go on the Family Leave Act? So it's just a question. It's not something that affects the language here. I'm just curious how it actually works.
Yeah, that sounds like something that we would have to do a deep dive with the attorney on. It seems to me that if they did qualify and had the proper medical documentation, that they would be entitled to the higher pay, since they were no longer able to take care of someone else and qualify for family leave, that they were actually sick themselves and then qualifying for a sick leave. That would be a case I would like to run by our labor attorney just in case before.
Mhm.
But it would seem like they could qualify under the described.
Anything we need to do right now?
I don't think it's a policy question. It's what would happen if in a particular situation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anything else? Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes. Sorry, I was on mute.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. We're now up to the second opportunity for public comment. Individuals and/or groups are invited to present their concerns, comments, and requests to the Board of Education at this time for any matters. In accordance with board policy, members of the public are allotted this opportunity to address the board for a maximum of 5 minutes during this period of the meeting. As this meeting is being conducted remotely as a virtual meeting, all public comments can be made by completing the form online. Board members are able to see all comments and will be posted for viewing at the appropriate point in the meeting.
So I've just stopped the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. And next, well, first I want to say, I know there were a lot of questions and comments about the whole reopening plan. Dr. Ficara, I think, gave an excellent update in terms of where we currently stand. And I think the questions will be noted and fold into the work that's going on, moving forward. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that the comments have been read, and hopefully we'll get answers as we continue to progress through the whole planning process. Next, we are up to old business, and we do have an item that we need to vote on, and it will be resolved that the board, having carefully considered the matter, hereby denies BRSA grievance number 0003 and directs the board secretary to inform the BRSA regarding its determination and the reasons therefor. Is there a motion?
So
So
moved.
moved. Second.
Okay, any discussion? And this would need to be in closed session, which we already had, but if there's any further discussion. Okay, roll call, please.
Mrs. Mead,
Yes.
Mrs. Hurley,
Yes.
Mr. Walker. You don't unmute.
Barry.
Mr. Walker,
Yes, I'm sorry. I put on mute.
Mr. Malik,
Yes.
Mr. Singer,
Yes.
Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
Mrs. Gladstone,
Yes.
Mrs. Barlow.
Yes, motion carries. Any other new business?
New or old?
Oh, I'm sorry. Any other old business?
I was just wondering, when can we expect our 9th board member?
I think she just went for fingerprinting on Monday. Mr. Stars, I don't know how long it typically takes to get that back.
Neither do I with the current situation, so.
And Mr. Singer, how long did it take before COVID?
I think it was 2 weeks before COVID.
Okay. So, Mrs. Hurley, we're still waiting is the bottom.
Time will tell.
Got it.
But it's making progress. So, and we are looking forward to Ms. Lee joining us. And I know I saw one of her comments on the open public meeting, open public comment section. I also want to mention with the retreat, I did cancel that for July 28th, and I've got like 4 dates from Ms. Thornton for the end of September or early October. So I'll send that out to the board members to see. Hopefully one of those dates will work for everyone. Any other old business? Okay. Any new business? Okay. Then that is it. Is there, let me just mention, we have 2 upcoming board meetings, one on August 3rd, which is a special meeting specifically to get the readout on the reopening plan that will be submitted to the governor. And then we also have August 25th. And at this time, both of those meetings are planned to be online. And is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Everyone have a great evening.
You too. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Take care.